Welcome to the next level.
Hey everyone, this is 8-Bit Flashback, and today I want to show you my mini retro console collection so far. I have a lot of fun buying these things, collecting them, and building them. Some of the consoles aren't that practical, but that's not what it's about. It's about bringing back memories and nostalgia, and I just have a lot of fun doing this. Okay, first console up is the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. This is a great console. It comes built in with 21 games, but you can mod it now and add thousands of games. And I got plenty of videos that have to do with that subject. This just in, before we continue with the regular program, here's a message from my conscience. Hey everyone, I want to talk about something serious. Pirating. Pirating is bad. You should only download or possess backups of games that you already own. Like me. I have over 8,000 different backups, but I also have 8,000 different physical games. So I got 4 games here. Another 7 right here. Another 5 here. A couple more here. And the other 7,967 games are in my room here somewhere. I'll find those later and I'll show you those. But just remember, pirating is not cool. Next up is another Super Nintendo Classic Edition, but this one is not a regular Super Nintendo. What this was a Super Nintendo case I purchased off eBay. Someone was parting out a Super Nintendo Classic Edition, and this was just an empty case. And what I've done is I've modded it with a Raspberry Pi 3 inside of it, and I've made a cartridge slot so you can play actual cartridges. Now these cartridges have little NFC tags, and when you stick them in a slot, there's an NFC reader that's programmed with the Raspberry Pi 3, and the game automatically loads. And I got multiple little cartridges I made for this with a 3D printer, and I even have a Game Genie cartridge. And with this setup, I don't have to play games that are just on cartridges. I have thousands and thousands of games that are loaded on an SD card. Alright, next up is another mini Super Nintendo, and this is a 3D printed case designed for a Raspberry Pi 3. And I've modded it to where it accepts USB cartridges. So instead of having NFC tags on them, I actually have a USB flash drive that I have installed inside the cartridge, and I have a USB port inside the cartridge slot that it plugs into. So what I've pretty much done is made a multi-cart with thousands of games on it. Next up is a mini Nintendo clone console, and inside this one is a Raspberry Pi Zero, and I also modded it to where the lid opens and it uses USB cartridges. And this was one of my very first console mods where I made the lid open so it could accept mini NES cartridges. So the craftsmanship on this one isn't quite as nice as my newer consoles, but hey, you gotta start somewhere. Next up is a NES Classic Edition clone, and this looks a lot like the real thing. It's even HDMI, it's got the same controller ports, but it's not the real deal. In fact, there's so many clones out there now, it's hard to find a real one. Next up is my Tower of Nintendos. On the bottom there we have the original Nintendo Entertainment System, and then on top of that I have a bunch of miniatures. So I'm going to start with the bottom and work my way up. The one on the bottom is another NES Classic Edition clone, and this one is heavily modified. So let me move these and we'll take a closer look. So to start off with, I cut the lid and I made it functional so it could accept cartridges, and this also takes USB cartridges. But instead of a Raspberry Pi 3 inside this, I have an Android computer inside of it from an Android TV box running Android 6.0. This has Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Miracast, all kinds of stuff that's already pre-built into the Android software. To make this function as a console, I had to wire USB ports to the front, wire up a power button, then on the back I had to cut holes for the HDMI port, power port, audio port, and Ethernet port. And the mini cartridges I made for this are also multi-carts with thousands of games on them. And I got most of the games running off an app called RetroArch. Next up is a 3D printed case, and I got this from megabitnes.com. And this one's NFC powered, so it has little mini cartridges with the little NFC tags inside of them, and when you load that and turn the system on, it automatically loads that game. And the computer inside this one's a Raspberry Pi 3, and this is probably one of my favorite Nintendos. The cartridges even click down in place, just like the original Nintendo. And for the controller ports, I got 2 USB inputs there in the front, and then on the back I have my power input, an HDMI output, and an AV composite output. Alright, next up is another 3D printed case. This is the Nintendo Zero Classic Edition, and this one's not finished yet. I still have some work to do to it. I gotta do some body work and some painting to it. And this one also takes cartridges, and it's powered by a Raspberry Pi Zero. And for my last Nintendo, this is another 3D printed case. This is called the Nintendo Micro Edition. And this one's also unfinished. I gotta do some sanding and some painting still. And this one takes even smaller NES cartridges. But maybe this one's just a little bit too small. This one's going to be powered by a Nintendo on a chip circuit board from a Chinese Nintendo clone. This circuit board's just barely small enough to fit inside there, and maybe one of these days I'll actually get it done. And I actually have a couple different variations of Nintendo circuit boards that'll work for this project. Next up is the Dreamcast Classic Edition, and I made this with my 3D printer, and I took a lot of extra time to sand this and paint it and put some decals on it. And this is powered by a modified Raspberry Pi 3. And for this Dreamcast, I have little tiny discs that have NFC tags on them, and when you load those in the Dreamcast and power it up, it loads right to that game via an NFC reader. So this operates very similar to the other two NFC consoles I have. And of course, I got my tiny Dreamcast controller and a VMU. But those are non-functional, they're just for looks. And here I got a couple different mini Dreamcast prototypes, and I'll probably never finish these. I had one Sports Edition and one regular Dreamcast, and as you can see here, they're a little bit more boxy. It's kind of like a half GameCube, half Dreamcast. But what I was doing is I was playing with a design where I could open a lid and also have functioning NFC discs. And these are both designed for a Raspberry Pi 3 board. And I made this with my 3D printer. And I went through quite a bit of trial and error trying to come up with a design where the lid would actually open and I'd have little discs that could function. And I do have some power and reset buttons here if I ever do decide to finish the project. And I'll go ahead and open this up and show you the discs inside. I got a Sonic Adventure disc. And this is meant to work with an NFC tag on the back of the disc, and then I'd have that NFC reader that'd be inside the console. And like I said, these are just prototypes. They're not the final design. These were just something I built so I could get the mechanics down for the project. Or maybe I could just leave them the way they are and call them the Dream Cube or the Cubecast. Or not. Okay, the last mini console today is the Sega Genesis Classic Edition. This was a Sega Genesis USB hub. So all this was to start with was a 4-port USB hub, and I converted this to a working console by putting a Raspberry Pi Zero inside this and converting those USB ports into controller ports, then making a functioning power switch and LED light. And right now I'm currently in the process of making another mini console from the early 90s. It's another one of my favorite consoles, and it definitely deserves a spot next to the rest of these. Any guesses? Alright guys, thanks for watching. If you want to hear more from me, please subscribe. And if you liked that video, please click that like button. And if you want to see more of my videos, just click any of these links.